Welcome back, everybody, to The Art of Change. This is Compassion Unleashed. This is going to be our last episode of this series, and this is on sustaining compassionate leadership. My name is Tony Stark Fernandez. I'm the Change Catalyst, and with me today, I have once again Julie Krause. Julie, a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, everybody. Again, for those of you that are new that haven't watched the other ones, which if you haven't, you better watch them. Little background on me is I have a master's in clinical art therapy and counseling, but I've worked for over the past decade in humanitarian aid, emergency response, and development. So I'm actually going to start this and drive this because I really, really, really wanted to talk. Last week I started talking about burnout, the little b burnout versus big B burnout. And I think this is something that, is talked a lot about now, especially, during COVID and post-COVID and with people being more mindful in terms of mental health and well-being. However, it's really hard sometimes for people, especially if they haven't gone through it, to know what that actually looks like. And for somebody like me, right? For somebody like me who doesn't do just a job, right? And I say that very specifically, it's not just a job for me. The work that I do is such a strong inner drive. It's my core ethics. It's what I feel very passionate about, particularly the global mental health that I've been working on. And so I started talking to you, Tony, last week about, this really exciting opportunity that I had last year going into Pakistan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was all geared up. I knew from the team that brought me on board, right, which they're pretty big people in global mental health. I knew that there was a potential for this not to be successful. Like I knew that going in, right? And so, but I also knew that I had the support of the people behind me. And this is one of the biggest things that I think after I get done telling my story that I'd like to talk about is I had systems set up in place. I knew that with my point person with the mental health reference group, and she has a clinical psychology background, and she's worked in the field for over 2 decades, and she's an amazing human being. Somebody that I would just want to hang out with outside of work. But I knew that if something happened, that I could contact her, that we would set up supportive supervision, sessions, clinical supervision, where we can just talk about these things, right? So I knew that I had all of those pieces. I knew that I had back home somebody that was very supportive of what I was going to do. And so I jumped right in, right? Really exciting. Hadn't been to Pakistan before, had done work for Afghanistan, been in that region before. On the day-to-day basis things, that was challenging for me, right? Driving on the other side of the road and the other side of the car. There were all these little pieces of what I was doing that weren't even necessarily work related, that was so new, so challenging. I was having to talk to all of these different partners. I was having to talk to embassies, going into all of these systems, the Ministry of Health. And it was so much. Everybody that I worked with was really passionate about what they were doing, and we were trying to make changes. And I tried as hard as I could, right? I tried to set these systems up knowing that I was only going to be there for a few months, hoping that there would be sustained change in terms of coordination, especially, post flooding in Pakistan, knowing that they're prone to floods. This would happen again. There had to be a system in place for coordination, that people and agencies couldn't just be functioning on their own.
Yeah, so let's dive in. Like you talked about sustainability and putting these systems together. One, you talked about a support system, which is obviously very crucial for each person, helping you get through burnout and things of that nature. What other types of systems from that you can see or recommend? And every organization is gonna be different, right? Your career field's a lot different, your
Right.
expertise, but what are
Looks
some
very
systems that
different.
we can help organizations think about? What are some systems they can put in place to help sustain that leadership environment?
Well, and in fact, that's something that I'm trying to build right now, while I'm supporting the Ukraine response remotely for a few months, right? So looking at their country office staff well-being protocols,
Mm-hmm.
right? The buddy system, right? And having a very clear buddy system for people to have somebody that it's a genuine check-in with one another. And then having systems set up in place when people aren't okay. Um, and really, I'm just trying to dive into what else can be created to make sure that people have some sort of mechanism. There's a staff well-being committee. And again, this looks very different because it's an emergency response setting. It's not a
Right.
corporation.
But
Um,
I want to chime in there for a second on a couple
yeah,
of key things. You know, one of the things that a lot of people tend to think about in these organizations is that, oh, that means I've got to check on my people regularly. And sometimes that can be too much, right? Like you have to create the environment that people feel comfortable and then
right.
allow them to know that, okay, you just, reach out, check in every once in a while, but we don't need to micromanage their level. I mean, you got to find your
No,
balance
no.
of care to your
Right,
organization. But the reality comes down to if you create the high trust culture environment, you create the safe space, naturally people will say something.
yeah,
I will be the first to admit that I have a hard time noticing when I'm stressed. I have a hard time noticing a burnout, and
right.
so I'm a workaholic, and so I have people all the time that will tell me, they're like, "Oh, Tony, like, how are you finding time to do X, Y, and Z?" And I have often now caught myself where I go, when somebody says that to me, I go, maybe I do have too much on my plate right now.
Right.
But at the same token, it's because I've worked in so many environments where I didn't have a safe space to say this. I don't have the capacity. I don't have the bandwidth to do X, Y, and Z. And especially if
Right.
you're a high performer, I'm going to hit this real hard. If you're a high performer, what's the number one thing people do to a high performer? Give them more work, right?
Right.
And so, what are you doing with these people? We're naturally creating this burnout, and it's not,
Right.
and it's kind of a positive if the person looks at it as a compliment. Like, we as an organization think you're our go-to person. We trust that. The flip side, and I believe in yin and yang, right? The flip side to that is the burnout. And so, finding that safe space to, one, recognize when we're doing that to our people, but also to allow them to be able to have a safe space where they can say, hey, I've got too much on my plate right now and I've got to be able to manage that. So that support system and the systems you're talking about in place um, are designed in a sense of, is just because, for example, yours is therapy doesn't mean it can't work in an organization, but we have to see
Exactly.
what are our pain points, right, in our organization, and then how do we
Right.
operate with those? Yeah.
Right. And being able to adapt it, because certainly, again, like it looks very different when, like, of course, I can set up a supportive supervision monthly check-in session with my team, right? I'm mental health. Sure, I can do that.
Right.
But that can be adapted. That can be utilized not just in mental health.
Yes.
And those buddy
Let's
systems, those
zoom
absolutely
in
can be utilized.
let's zoom into that adaptability. You hit my another one of my buzzwords, right? When we
Yeah.
start talking about these leadership styles, you have the different kinds, which I'm not going to go into all of them. But the one that I'm trying to push, obviously, you and I've talked about is the concept of being an evolutionary leader, right? And then the key is on that is adaptability. And the reality
Right.
comes down to Julie and I and anybody else, John Maxwell, Simon Sinek, Brene Brown, all these individuals who talk about vulnerability, high trust cultures, developing leadership, all of that. We can sit down and outline, hey, here are the things that work. But the reality
Right.
is it may not work for your organization. You
And it
as a
might not
leader,
work for you either.
right? So we have to train adaptable leaders, not just leaders who understand empathy, not just compassion, but also adaptability, right? I get 10 people to work for me. I need to adapt to each individual person. I need to adapt to different teams. I might be in charge of 3 teams of 50
Right.
people each team, right? Well, not one person can manage that many people without having a leadership team underneath, right? At the end of the day, that's extreme. If you try, you're probably doing a disservice to your people, right?
Right.
So it comes down to understanding how to manage it, and then again, adaptability, right? I have to adapt to one level of subordinates, and then my leadership team is another level subordinates. They still work
Right.
for you, right? And so it's kind of the same thing like when I do my speeches, right? Whenever I give a keynote speech or I do a workshop, it's catered differently to an audience. Same concept. I'm going to work with somebody who's a brand new member to the team way differently than I'm going to make my leadership team, work with me as well, because you have to adapt. You have to be able to change to meet the needs of those individuals. Because at the end of the day, if they're trying to adapt to you, right, that's not going to be as successful as you adapting to them. Because at the end of the day,
Right.
as a leader, and I still believe this, as leaders, we work for our people. So you have to adjust, you have to adapt to those individuals and make the environment conducive for them to operate at their maximum capability.
And I'd immediately just like pause there and say that I'd imagine, right? I can't assume that most leaders, if they haven't been doing things in this way, that's going to sound completely overwhelming.
Yeah.
Too much. Like how do I change myself in every single thing, every interaction, everything I do? But that is what you've been talking about through all of your series, right? It's utilizing these tools to be able to adapt,
Yeah.
right? And
And
you're
you know what?
still you at the core of your person, but just being
Yeah.
able to make sure that
Let's
people can
jump on that. You're
succeed.
right. Let's talk
Yeah.
about that. So leaders listening to this podcast and attending these, workshops, and you're not going to be a new leader tomorrow. You're going to start your journey. And so how do
Right.
you do it without being overwhelmed, like Julie talked about, right? We start small. Chip away at the little things that add to the big things, right? I want to be a more empathetic leader. How do I do that? And you start with the small things, right? Could be the first thing as simple as coming in, and maybe you're the leader that I don't like to bother my people. I'm introverted and I want to just get to my desk and get started. They've got things to do. Well, okay, but what if part of your empathetic style is you're like, you know what? I just want to at least let my team know that I'm here for them, right? What does that look like for you? I know one of the things that I used to love doing. Some people love it, some people hate it. I used to bring bagels every Monday to my team, right? Every Monday, I knew my team hated Mondays, right? Oh, we just got a real long, nice weekend, back to work,
Right.
hit the grind. So I always did some kind of breakfast. Bagels was usually the one that they always liked the most, but I adapt. If they wanted donuts, I'd get them donuts. If they want Chick-fil-A, I get the Chick-fil-A, whatever it might be. But that was just one little thing to show them I cared because I knew Mondays were a little tough of a start. Um,
Hmm.
and that's not a solution for everyone. I'm not saying, hey, go buy donuts for your people tomorrow morning, kind of thing. But at the end of the day, what is it that you can do to show you care to your people? And just start small and build from there, right? So think of today and who you are as a leader, and what can you do tomorrow to strengthen that and be more empathetic. Another one that's going to be hard for people to think about is do some self-reflection. What do you think maybe you're doing to hinder that environment? Maybe there's things that you're about your style that's not helping the environment. And that's what I would tell you, I do know this is therapy, but that's probably the hardest thing for people to do. Self-reflection, where are my flaws in this big
Right.
picture? How do I change? And that's key about being adaptable. Once you can own and be accountable for your own issues or what you're bringing, the faster you can create a better system and a better organization. But on top of that, I don't know about you, Julie, but I worked for a ton of bosses, and the ones that owned when they were like, you know what, this is not the
Yep.
way I should be doing business.
Yes.
Respect them 10,000 times more. And in knowing
Yes.
that, how hard it was for them to say, I messed up or that's
Yep.
on me, right? But it's hard. None of us want to admit when we did something wrong, right? We want to believe that we never do anything wrong. But the sooner that we can change that mindset, adapt to our people and go, okay, here's what happened. I own it. We're going to press through it. Is the better that vulnerability. Actually, that's a great one. Brene, vulnerability,
That's what I
right?
was going to try to jump in and say, but you were like on a really, really good point. I was
Yeah,
like, that is
vulnerability.
being vulnerable. And
Yeah,
that in turn, like you're allowing that space for your team to also be vulnerable. And it's going to take time. It's not going to
right,
be immediate. And people aren't like, if if your team member is coming in vomiting everything at you, that's actually a red flag. Right.
right,
But if
right,
you're open, you're vulnerable and you say, hey, look, I screwed up. Like I totally missed this. That's on me. Right. Then that's you're being vulnerable and that in further leads to actual trust.
right.
Then you're humanizing yourself.
Yeah,
Right.
and
And
at the end of
even
the day, we all make mistakes, right?
it's
I'm
true. And I was just going to say like a really, really easy, like one of the most easy low hanging fruit if it's like a corporation and not another kind of job. Most corporations have teams or some other kind of like Slack, whatever, right? Just recognizing to your team and saying like, hey, if there's something that you want to talk to me about and you see an open space on my calendar, just go ahead and book a time. In
right,
turn, you need to make sure you're putting your schedule in appropriately. However, like just allowing that space, right? Just book out 15 minutes, it's fine, right? And
yeah,
even if it's just nothing that they come and talk about, that is further building that culture.
Yeah, and I'll use another military example of one I've seen is I got in the service at a time where just like most of the other prior service members can talk about is we call it the shut up and color mind of, hey, leader comes down with a decision, we got to get this done, I don't need a why, I need you to just do right. And at the end of the day, what people tend to forget is that people question when they don't trust. So if a
Right.
directive comes down and your people are asking you why, that's something to think about. Are they questioning because they don't trust your decision making, or they don't trust the senior leaders that are above you? Because obviously, right, president makes a decision, I don't really get a say, right? But I'm gonna have to execute whatever has to come down. And it's sometimes, and I can go in this rabbit hole for a while. We're not going to go into that. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, part of creating this high trust culture environment will allow you to be able to make those decisions, and you're going to have less resistance from people questioning why that decision was made. But on top of that, if you get into that room and you're able to say, here's the decision we made, here's why, and help them answer that, and if you if there's time and you're able to take suggestions, it's always a beneficial thing because people want to be heard.
I
I
was
can't
gonna
voice.
say, like, one of those reasons that they might be saying why is because they're doing the actual groundwork, and
Right.
they might have a clearer and actually better understanding of why that might not work. So they might be asking why because they're going to have actual better data for you to then be able
Right.
to go back to your leaders and say, look, like, we put this in place, however, X, Y,
Uh-huh.
and Z, and here's the data to back it up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I remember, looking back, there's some, like, one mentor I talked about before. Um, you know, for me, they might make a decision, and in the back of my head, I might go, I don't know if I think that's the best decision. I'm not going to say that. I might pull them aside and say, hey, sir, do you have a second? Like, I think that we need to rethink that decision you made. Um,
Yeah.
But the other reality comes down to as well of, I'll follow that individual blindly because I trust them. And in my head, I'll
Yeah.
go, I can talk about them of the I can understand it later, but it's got to get done, and this person knows what they're doing, right? And that's that trust.
And I
It
think
does,
that it depends on which kind of job, which corporation, which kind of company
right,
that you're running, because like on the opposite of that is before I'm out actually having people rolling things out in the field, I want all of that clarification. So if somebody's
right,
questioning me, I want them to question that at the very moment and say, I don't understand.
yeah,
And here are my questions, and this is what is not understandable. So I need
right.
that immediately. So it's going to look different again depending on what kind of company. Because if
Well,
you have, like, if you're manufacturing something,
yeah,
you don't want people to just go, okay, let's just do this, even though they know by putting a
mhm,
bolt in here, everything else is going to break down.
right, yeah, and as you put that, time and space, right? Like at the end of the day, like sometimes we don't have the time, right? Like maybe a decision has to be made on the spot for, let's say, it's an Amazon, right? And something happened with sending out packages, and it's, I'm using a loose change because I've never worked for Amazon, but it's crucial. We got to fix this process, otherwise we're going to lose millions of dollars on things
Right.
being sent out. And that person on the front line might be like, hey, I got an easy fix for that, right? That's good, but they should be able to trust into their direct leader, right? To say, hey, boss, I know the highest is saying we got to do this. However, this one tweak is going to solve it. But that's the different levels of echelon of trust, right?
Right.
CEO, as you can see on my video, CEO is up here giving a directive. Doesn't mean the lower level has to go to the CEO, right? Vision,
Right.
guidance, fix it here, right? And they should be able to trust, this person should be able to trust to this boss and go, hey, I heard the big boss, Jeff Bezos, said we got to do this, right? We got to do more. We got to help clean the environment. What about doing it this way? Right? Maybe that's something we can push up the echelon. Let's knock it out the way you're talking about now, but I think there's a better way to do this. And if we can try to look into that. And that's where if
Right.
they have that safe environment where they feel comfortable talking to their supervisor or their bosses, again, company as a whole is going to improve drastically. And it works its way
Right.
up as it works its way down, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that
So
I was just gonna say that that's where, like, the balance point comes in. Like,
mhm.
and that's where, like, you have to be able to make that call or just pause and say, okay, well, we'll 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 put that on hold for right now.
Yeah. So I think to sum it up, because, obviously this is a one of those topics that could go on for a long time, right? So the reality comes down to, as we think about how to sustain compassionate leadership, this is not an overnight thing, but we have to think about the many different levels. levels of the organization, the many different levels of decision making, the levels of care, support that needs to be put into there. And that can sound overwhelming. And as you mentioned, right, we just have to start small, chip away at the little. We build our leadership of being compassionate over time. It's an investment in the long haul. And so with that, we'll leave to caveat, building these type of leaders doesn't happen from listening to a podcast. This will hopefully, get people interested. How do I do that? And so for those out there listening, Start Consulting Services here, we have a workshop on building evolutionary leaders. And so if you're interested, please reach out to the organization. Our dynamic leaders can bring keynotes to the organizations. We can bring a workshop to the organization, and that will start the trickle effect, that ripple effect of developing these leaders so we can bring success to your organization and bring that high trust culture back. So everyone, thank again, Julie, for joining us today. Hopefully you got a lot out of the Compassionate Leadership series. Remember, we had season 1, which was motivational interviewing, leading into series 2 with empathetic leadership and empathy in action, following into the season 3 of Compassion Unleashed. And so stay tuned, more podcasts to come from 2025. But for now, we're going to leave you guessing on what's coming. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. And feel free, ping us, subscribe, send Start Consulting some information or questions, and we will happily work with you, to your team and your organization. Thanks, everyone, and have a great one.
Thanks for having me. Bye.